One thing to be aware of is what we call selective exposure. We know from research that consumers tend to avoid exposure, right? So, one thing that's really interesting is that uh, research has shown that the DVR is really not an issue. Why is that? It used to be assumed that when the DVR came out, right, when DVRs came out, that people would skip through ads, and that is the main reason that other people that consumers aren't seeing ads on television. It turns out that it's not the DVR, right? It's not that people record shows and then skipped ads. It's really that even throughout the show and throughout commercials, a lot of people are really stuck on their cell phones doing things. And so that's the main way that people are avoiding the show itself as well as advertisements. So people and their cell phones are more problematic than the DVR. So anyway, we know that consumers avoid advertising. We call this selective exposure. There are some ways that consumers selectively avoid exposure to advertising messages, and I'll talk about a few. The first is called zipping. That is when people fast forward through a commercial on a pre-recorded program. So using the DVR, you're watching a program, commercials come, and you fast forward through that commercial. Another one, I guess, is called zapping. So this happens when you switch channels when a commercial appears. So you're watching TV, commercial comes on, you go to another channel. And then, of course, we always talk about muting, which is when you turn off the sound that should say during commercial breaks, not curing, but turn off the sound during commercial breaks. So zipping, zapping, and muting are three ways that consumers avoid advertising um, when they're watching a program. And so if you're an advertiser, you want to know if this is really happening throughout your program, and what you can do to make sure that this isn't true, right? You make your advertisements more interesting. Maybe you offer giveaways throughout the ad. You get people really focused on the television show, so they're scared to change channels so they don't miss anything, so on and so forth. Because advertising is really expensive, and you're paying, if you're a company, of course, you're paying for this exposure. I mentioned earlier that we were going to circle back to product placements. So, product placements occur when companies embed their brand, their logo, their products within a storyline. They can do that using a movie. They can do it on television shows or in television shows. Any kind of storyline, more so than traditional ads, the advertisements you see on TV that happen between storylines, right? They're not a part of the actual show. They can be more effective than traditional ads, and I'll give you four reasons why. One, they grab attention. Consumers tend to pay attention either consciously or subconsciously of product placements, and so consumers tend to notice them. Two, they can be cost efficient. In some cases, it costs significantly less to pay for product placements than it does to pay for advertisements, especially when you think about advertisements on primetime television, and or advertisements during specific uh, big television events. So, for example, it may be more cost efficient to put your movie in the Avenger, put your brand, your logo, or your product in a movie like The Avengers or James Bond than it would to pay for a 1 minute advertising spot during the Super Bowl, which is coming up, or during the Final Four or something like this. Um, Unlike, and this is a big deal, number three is a big deal. Unlike traditional advertisements where you can zip, you can zap, or you can mute, um, when you embed your product within the show itself, within the storyline, consumers traditionally don't mute or skip over those, right? So no one is turning off their TV during a show they want to see because the actor is using, a Dell laptop, for example. And then it also can be highly influential. If an actor you like, let's say, Daniel Craig as James Bond is using a Dell laptop, it can influence consumers, and it does influence consumers to go out and buy themselves a Dell laptop, right? If their favorite character or even their least favorite character on a show they love is using a product, um, and they know, and the consumer sees it either consciously or subconsciously, it can be highly influential. So Ashton Kutcher talked about product placement with the celebrity themselves, which is a different form of product placement than we originally talked about or discussed, um, but also quite effective, as he mentions when he talks about the $50,000 car. If we go back to product placement success or product placement within movies, there are several examples that show that product placement is very successful. So you have the Mini that was used in, for example, you have the Mini that was used in The Italian Job. After the movie came out, the Mini saw a 22% increase in sales. The movie E.T. Showed some of the characters eating Reese Pieces. It cost $1 million for Reese's to do this, but they saw an increase in a 65% increase in profit after the movie came out. Risky Business, a really popular older movie with Tom Cruise, saw also a lot of product placement success, a 500% increase in people deciding that they wanted to be in the Navy, which was huge for the Navy, right? So this movie comes out, and all of a sudden people are asking to be in the Navy as opposed to the Navy having to recruit consumers. The movie also led to an increase of about 360,000 units of Ray-Ban glasses. In the movie, Tom Cruise was using Ray-Ban, and people said, I got to get myself some of these Ray-Bans. In Toy Story, really interesting story, the movie Toy Story came out. We saw Mr. Potato Head have an 800% increase in sales after Toy Story came out, the original Toy Story. We also saw a huge increase in Etch-a-Sketch. So after Toy Story came out, there was a, 4,000% increase um, in Etch-a-Sketch. I'm not sure if that's units or sales, I'll be honest, but that's pretty awesome. And I will say that Etch-a-Sketch deserves that because Etch-a-Sketch is an awesome toy. And I say that as a woman who had an Etch-a-Sketch when she was younger and had absolutely no skills using it, but enjoyed it for hours and hours and hours. So again, product placement can be very successful. So having the product in the movie or in the television show, or in uh, the actor or actress's hands are obvious ways to get consumers to notice a product either consciously or subconsciously. Um, but if you really want to be effective, if you want people to remember the product placement, if you want people to 100% act on it, you should have, and this makes sense, you should have the actors or actresses or whoever talk up the product. And so Nielsen did some research to see what was the most recalled in program product placements and dramas and sitcoms, and they found something really interesting. It came to be known, and this again makes total sense, that people are going to remember things more if the leads or even non-lead actors and actresses talk up the features of the product itself. And so they saw, like, on Castle um, and on Bones, the main leads talked up the features of the cars that were included in the show. So car companies did product placement to put their cars in the show. They had the actors or actresses talk about those products, and consumers remembered those product placements more. So, if the actor is like, oh, yes, this Toyota Avalon is really great. I just love these heated seats, and I love how it has this great GPS system. Consumers are just going to remember that. And it probably later on when they're trying to look for a car, they'll remember it then too, right? It just tends to be more effective. So, marketing actions when it comes to exposure, what we want to do is encourage continued exposure. So, we can do that with infomercials, we can do that with advert games. We talked about advert games last week. Specifically, we talked about young kids seeing advert games. We know that when people use advert games, right? So McDonald's has one, Pizza Hut has one. They can stay on these games for 15 minutes to an hour, and it doesn't have to be little kids. Adults use these games as well. When people play advert games, they're exposed to advertising for 15 minutes to an hour, right? That's a big deal. And when they're on these advert games, it tends to increase the frequency of brand purchase. Two-thirds of people who play these advert games come back to play more. What's really astounding to me is that 81% of players will email their friends to try a good game. I personally have never been emailed by a friend or someone I know to try an advert game. I would find that extremely weird, but people who are my friends know me. And so maybe one of the things that's true is that they don't email me because they know me, and they know that I would find it weird. I don't know. I'm vocal on the weirdness of kind of and things that I find weird. I guess that's me. FYI for you. All right. So marketers have a lot of in-store marketing tactics to get you to attend to and comprehend and kind of be exposed to their brands. So they have these standalone displays. Some places will let you taste product or sample products. I don't know how that's going to work after COVID. Product giveaways, and music and advertising and so on and so forth. So it's hard to talk about sensory marketing without talking about these thresholds that exist. So oftentimes we look at Weber's law or Weber's law, different people pronounce it differently, which just says the amount of change that is necessary to be noticed is systematically related to the intensity of the original stimulus. The stronger the initial stimulus, the greater a change must be for it to be noticed, which makes a lot of sense. And I think this is a great example. If you make $10 an hour, you might need, let's say, 50 cents to notice the difference, an additional 50 cents per hour to notice the difference in terms of a raise. However, if you make $20 an hour, right, this is a stronger initial stimulus, you're going to need more money in order for you to really notice the difference. So if you make $20 an hour in this instance, you might need to receive a dollar extra an hour to actually notice the difference. This is why a lot of people don't notice differences when it comes to, paltry raises. So if you're in a situation where you don't get a raise or they give you a 1% raise, it's just not as noticeable because 1% is just not a lot comparatively for most people. We'll spend the next few slides talking about thresholds. And so we'll first start with the idea of absolute threshold. So the absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulation that can be detected on a given sensory channel. So for example, on a billboard, what's the minimum amount of stimulation that can be detected by consumers, right? So is the billboard size big enough? Are the colors bold enough? So on and so forth. Over time, the absolute threshold tends to get smaller and smaller as consumers get used to a stimulus, right? So we start to adapt to we tend to engage in sensory adaptation, so we start to adapt to this our senses start to adapt. This would be the reason why people will start off using a smaller amount of a new fragrance, and then after a while they'll use more and more because they can't smell it as strongly, because their nose gets used to the scent, so they must use more. Just like consumers and their noses, marketers need to increase or change sensory inputs in order to keep the attention of their target market. So, just like a consumer needs to increase the amount of perfume they use, we as marketers must increase either a promotion for people to notice a promotion, or we increase the size of the billboard, so on and so forth, so people can continue to notice the promotions or sales tactics or advertisements that we're using. So I'll give you an example of absolute threshold. A few years ago, the NBA decided to allow a change in jerseys. Does anyone know? Do you know off the top of your head what the change was? For those of you who don't, the NBA started allowing companies to put their logos on, or yeah, their logos on jerseys. And so you can see for the Boston Celtics, GE started putting their logo on their jerseys. For the Kings, Blue Diamond Almonds started putting their logo on jerseys. For the Utah Jazz, the company that owns Qualtrics paid to have the Utah Jazz put not their logo, not Qualtrics' logo on there, but the logo of a charity that the owner also supports, which I think is like Five for Fighting or something like this. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's a charity. I think it might be cancer, but again, I can't remember off the top of my head. The question, though, now becomes, and I think this was one of the reasons they wouldn't do it to begin with, and they finally relented and allowed it for advertising and money making purposes, is if the logos start off small, as you can see they are small here, eventually consumers are going to tune it out. Companies are going to be less invested in paying for this space, this premium space on jerseys, and so are companies going to want bigger and bigger logos on the jerseys for their money's worth. And it makes sense that they would, but then it becomes one of those things where it's like, oh, you're selling out the brand, you're selling out the sports company, so on and so forth. And I think this will cause a lot of issues down the road. So differential threshold, another type of threshold, is how much stronger one stimulus needs to be relative to another, so someone can notice that the two are not the same. So how different does, let's say, the Pepsi logos you see on your right, or my right, need to be for people to notice that they're different? So can the average consumer tell a difference between Pepsi's logo in 1898 versus the Pepsi logo in 1905, the Pepsi logo in 1998 versus 2003 versus today, for example? And so we're constantly trying to figure out this differential threshold. Weber's law states that the greater the initial stimulus, the greater the additional stimulus needs to be in order to be noticeable, right? So if you have this really, really noticeable initial stimulus, then you have to just really up your game a lot more for the next stimulus or additional stimulus to be noticed. So, for example, we could look at Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker here, I mean, is just kind of interesting. So Betty Crocker has definitely evolved. Um, One thing about Betty Crocker, though, I hope you notice, is that Betty Crocker actually doesn't look that different, in my opinion. She doesn't, I don't think she's that, I don't know. I mean, you'll have to think about, I don't know. Uh, I don't think she looks that different. One thing that does look different are Betty's, I hope we're on a first name basis, Betty, Betty's clothes. Um, so she goes from wearing, this red and white on the very end at the top left to wearing a full red suit with white pearls, and the third picture to wearing a white shirt with a red, it looks like a red sweater pulled over. I don't know. I would argue that this is not that great in terms of kind of changing the stimulus. But what I will say, and what I think where Betty Crocker is going really well, or doing really well here, is that the initial stimulus isn't that great, right? So the change doesn't have to be that great for people to notice a difference, right? So again, when we talk about this differential threshold, because the initial stimulus isn't, that impactful, um, any new changes also don't have to be that impactful. And so I guess they're winning, I guess is what we could say here. So it's hard to talk about it's hard to talk about stimuli changing and whether or not the consumer notices without talking about shrinkflation. So shrinkflation is a title given to shrinking products, right? So over time, companies will often shrink the size of products, and they say things like, "We're shrinking the size of products to keep up with the fact that the cost of inputs continue to rise, right? And we don't want to raise our prices." Although I'm not sure I actually believe that, because a lot of companies will raise their prices and go ahead and shrink the product too, right? And we've seen instances where products get smaller because raw materials cost more, but when raw materials start costing less, you don't see those products go back to their regular size. I mean, they're I'm not sure if I said this in the slide or two ahead when I talked about Weber's law. Another way, or another way to discuss Weber's law, or another name for Weber's law, is actually just noticeable difference, or JND. So keep that in mind for the exam. I usually like to say JND as opposed to Weber's law, or just noticeable difference as opposed to Weber's law, just so you know, and you can, be ready for that on the exam. So applications of Weber's law, or J&D, to marketing. Uh, One, it affects price changes. It applies to price changes. So to be effective, price discounts have to exceed the just noticeable difference, meaning that if you want people to notice a price discount, you have to make it large enough that people can notice it, right? So if the price of cereal is $3.48, and you give people a 2 cents discount, and you make it, $3.46. This isn't this is doesn't exceed the just noticeable difference. That's barely noticeable, right? So no one's going to pay attention to that. On the other hand, if you knock off 15 cents, maybe people would notice it a little bit more. This is why companies tend to use percentages as opposed to amounts. By the way, on the flip side of that, price increases should be below the just noticeable difference. So you want people to see price increases as not being that big, right? So you want it to be lower than the just noticeable difference, right? So in addition to that, negative changes, whether it's reduction in product size, or as again, or quality, or as I said a second ago, increases in price need to be not noticeable. Changes in product or package size, companies often use a strategy of downsizing to combat the price increase, or I'm sorry, to combat rising cost of ingredients. This is a smart strategy, but again, you want to make sure that this isn't noticeable, right? You want to make sure that people don't notice this kind of a thing, that they don't notice that the package size is dwindling. In each of the last three lectures, I've talked about pricing at some point, because pricing strategies are so important to marketers, because it's so important to consumers, right? Price is an information cue that is perceived and interpreted by consumers, right? How you price an item means something to people. If you set a high price, consumers are going to assume that it means high quality. If you set a low price, consumers are going to usually assume the opposite, right? You have to also think of things like your reference price, which is the price against which buyers compare the actual selling price, right? So if you have an item on your shelf and you've priced it at, let's say, $33.99, and you said this isn't a sale, well, if a person who shops at your store every single week comes in and they notice that this says $33.99 on sale, but every time they've looked at it for the last few weeks, it said $33.99 is its normal price, no one is going to think that that's a sale, right? They've seen that price, and now you see a sale sticker on it, but the price itself hasn't changed. There's going to be a problem, because the reference price is $33.99 for that consumer, and your sales price tag means nothing. At the exact same time, we have to remember that consumers are really good about comparing the original price to the sales price, right? So if you say something is on sale for $33.99, but the regular price was $34, most people aren't going to actually consider that a sale, minus a penny. What is that, right? And frankly, sometimes, some sales prices just are too low. If you're giving a 3% discount, it's just, for a lot of people, just not good enough. So something to keep in mind. Other influences of perceptual distortion, there are two effects that are relevant here. The first is called the halo effect. The other is called the horns effect. I'm going to describe them, and then I'm actually going to let you watch a short video that gives examples of them. So the halo effect occurs when an individual generalizes about a variety of attributes based on knowledge of one attribute of an individual or product or service. What does this mean? It's it's essentially when you take one positive characteristic about a person, a brand, or a service, and you then assume that because of that one, that one positive characteristic means that the product, the service, or the person is totally good, right? So, an example, and again, I'm going to let the video explain it, even though the video is only 1 minute. It is pretty thorough. So an example would be Subway. So Subway, the sandwich company, has one positive characteristic. their food is fresh, right? That's a positive characteristic. And we could argue that it's fresher than, let's say, something like McDonald's or Burger King or somewhere like that. And so some people, and Subway has actually kind of promoted this, but some people will say, their food is fresh. That's one positive characteristic. And they'll assume that that means that their food is positive, right? So, for example, their food is fresh, positive characteristic, so their food must be healthy. Their food is fresh, so their food must be good, right? So they take one positive characteristic and they extrapolate that to mean that the entire product is good, or the entire person or service is good. The Horns effect is the opposite. So you take one negative characteristic and you assume that because of that one negative characteristic, the whole thing, whether it's a product or service or an individual, is bad. So, oh, this food is frozen, so this food must not be healthy, or this food is frozen, so this food is bad, right? This food is frozen, so it, doesn't taste good. Something like that. And that also is doesn't really happen either, but that's just a perceptual distortion. Again, if I highly recommend that you watch the video here for other examples. Plus, it's a really cute video. So now we turn our attention to attention. Haha, pun intended. Attention is the cognitive process of selectively concentrating on one aspect of the environment while ignoring other things. It is the purposeful allocation of information processing capacity, so our mental capacity, toward developing an understanding of some stimulus. Um, so I'll give you an example. One of my favorite television shows, and I don't have many, is Arrested Development. Really like Arrested Development. When Arrested Development comes on, I will more than likely ignore most of the other things going on in the room, right? So whether it's people talking to me, um, whether it's work to be done, so on and so forth. One thing to remember about attention is that the same individual may devote different levels of attention to the same stimulus in different situations. So I might tune out work to be done and people talking to me when I'm really involved in Arrested Development. But if I'm studying for a final exam or a certificate or something like this, and Arrested Development is on, then I definitely am not paying Arrested Development the same type of attention because of the context, right? The situation going on. Similar to you, you may be very involved in, a certain television show or someone you love, right? Maybe you really devote a lot of time and attention to your partner and listening to what he or she has to say. But the minute that something important comes up, you're listening with, half your ear, or, one ear, or so on and so forth. You're barely paying them attention because something important has come up and you must devote some level of attention to something else. So, one thing to be aware of is that exposure is not equal to attention. So, for exposure, there's a lower threshold. If I'm driving on the highway and I see a billboard, okay, I see a billboard. Am I actually attending to that billboard? Am I giving that billboard my attention? If I'm in class and the professor is speaking, I can likely hear them speaking, but am I paying any attention to what is being said? For those of you who may be tuning me out right now, right? Um, so, to a certain extent, exposure is under the control of the marketer and the consumer. If you are a marketer, our goal is, of course, to increase exposure but avoid wear out. We don't want you to hear the same advertisement, see the same advertisement, so on and so forth, over and over, and eventually get sick and tired of it. For attention, we have a limited capacity as people. There's only so much that we can really give our attention to, and unfortunately, we have a cluttered environment. There's a lot of stuff that we could give our attention to. Um, we we give our attention to both external and internal foci. Well, external and internal stimuli. For attention, we often notice things that are a contrast, right? We often notice contrast. So, if I were giving a lecture right now, or you're listening to me right now, you might actually start paying more attention if I start screaming, right? As opposed to my normal voice, which is somewhat loud in lecture situations, but not screaming. So the contrast between my normal voice and what I was just doing right there might jolt you into paying more attention to me. Um, we also tend to pay more attention, and we'll talk about this more on later slides, to things that are personally relevant. So if we can, as marketers, increase personal relevance, people will pay more attention to what we're trying to um, get the consumer to notice. One thing to remember is that grabbing attention is not the final objective for all marketers. Indeed, not even most marketers, right? So for some companies and for some things, grabbing attention is the final objective, right? So for a long time, for social media influencers, grabbing the attention, them grabbing your attention really was the end objective. They needed you to subscribe to them, or they needed you to notice them so they could say, I get X number of page views. Um, Now, not only do they need you to pay attention to them, they need you to like them, um, and they need you to subscribe to them, because ultimately they want you to buy whatever product they're selling because they want to get paid by companies, right? On the other hand, for a lot of products, we don't just want your attention. We want you to follow through and watch our television show. We want you to follow through and watch our advertisements. We want you to follow through and buy our products, so on and so forth. Another thing to consider is adaptation, which is defined as the degree to which consumers continue to notice a stimulus over time. So factors that lead to adaptation, less intensity, right? So less intense stimuli habituate because they have less sensory impact, meaning less intense stimuli get ignored because you don't notice them as much because it's not that intense. Duration, so stimuli that require relatively lengthy exposures in order to be processed tend to habituate because they require a long attention span. Think about this. If you're on YouTube right now and you're trying to watch a video and the video keeps having commercials in the middle of it, which a lot of YouTube videos do, you're much more likely to kind of ignore and or not really pay attention to the longer videos because they're so long, frankly. Discrimination. So simple stimuli tend to habituate because they don't require your attention to detail, right? So same thing, nothing about it stands out, and so you as a consumer are not able to discriminate that this is new, exciting, interesting, whatever information, so you just kind of ignore it. Exposure, right? So if you see something over and over and over again, it will habituate or have less of an impact because you've seen it so many times, right? So if you drive to work and you pass by, let's say, some billboards or some ads, after a while, you're not going to pay attention to those billboards or ads at all because you've seen them so often. They say the exact same thing, right? And then last but not least, relevance. So stimuli that are irrelevant or unimportant will habituate because they fail to attract your attention. So for example, if you don't have kids and you're driving, again, you're driving to work and there's a billboard and it's about, breastfeeding, you're just really not going to pay a lot of attention because you may not have a kid, right? Or it may not be relevant to you because, you know, um, it's just not that interesting to you.